Is it possible, and this will go a little bit out there, but is it possible that it is a problem of perception? In other words, people might be seeing something that their brains can't understand, say something that's, Carl Sagan once floated the idea of a tesseract, seeing something in an upper dimension or whatever, and then it comes across to us as a phenomenon like this that doesn't make any sense or seems deceptive or something like that. Could it simply be that's the nature of it, that it what we see isn't what it actually is, and that our brains are interpreting it, painting in? I think a large amount of what we see visually is the brain painting things in,
Yeah.
instead of what's actually there. It's reconstructing. So is it possible that that's what this is a phenomenon of the brain? And to tie that in to the most disturbing aspect of the phenomenon, and honestly the main reason I'm looking into it as a talk show host, is injuries. There have been people injured by exposure to a UAP. Well, that opens up the question: is what happens first, the injury or the sighting in those few seconds? And that they might not really be remembering what they actually saw, and it might have been something completely different than what's in our normal experience in life.
I do tend to agree with you regarding human perception, which is at best imperfect and always has been imperfect. Eyewitness testimony, though, also has been used to convict a lot of people in courts over time. But from the point of view of human perception, I think there's sort of a group of people who are starting to really look at that from the point of view of UFOs, and that would be people like Bernardo Kastrup, Donald Hoffman, Federico Fahim, the guy who actually invented the microprocessor at Intel, Jeffrey Kripal from Rice University, even Robert Lanza, who's a stem cell biologist. All of these people are basically saying that human perception is imperfect at best, but it's even worse than that, that there's a filter between what really is out there versus what we perceive. So, that Bernardo Kastrup has this analogy of an airplane cockpit. You're looking at the dials and the instruments of an airplane cockpit, and outside this airplane, there's a storm, a really heavy duty storm brewing. And all human perception is really flying by these instruments in the cockpit. And the UFO phenomenon is obviously much more adept at understanding human perception, or probably is much more adept at understanding human perception. And therefore, what we see is kind of only in relationship to a set of dials in a cockpit compared to what's happening with the UFO. So I think your question is right on there, but I think we're in a lot worse shape than a lot of people give it credit for, because I think the laws of physics are based on how we read these cockpit instruments. And the phenomenon seems to be able to come in and out of the cockpit, so to speak.
Magnets on the compass. You can fool a compass with a magnet.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, this brings up the idea of, okay, well, you can't really at this point say this phenomenon is of alien origin, even though we'd like to. That would be convenient. But maybe there is something out there that's weirder than aliens, something more elemental, something more that's been with us, that's a component to perhaps humanity itself. And that again references Jacques Vallée's work, because sometimes this looks a lot like folklore, or whatever creates folklore. Let's put it that way. And I wonder if we're just seeing something that we've always seen that has recast itself as the UAP phenomenon, and that it's something much, much older than that, and something not of the nature. It's just that we currently happen to be thinking about aliens and SETI and things like that, when in fact this might be something else. Do you think that has legs, that this might be an evolving phenomenon?
Yeah, I'm obviously a great fan of Jacques Vallée. Jacques Vallée joined the National Institute for Discovery Science Advisory Board in 1995, and I was hired at NIDS in 1996. So I've been, it's almost like a sort of Vale has been almost like a mentor because over the years, National Institute for Discovery Science was spending a lot of time and effort and money looking at the UFO phenomenon. But Jacques Vallée was always a part of that. He was fundamental to a lot of the brainstorming that happened in 2008 at the very early stages of the OSAP program, the Advanced Aerospace Weapons Systems Application program, that began through the Defense Intelligence Agency in September of 2008. Vallée was instrumental in designing the UFO database. Well, actually, it was a data warehouse that was used during the OSAP program, and the Vallée called it the Capella data warehouse. And that data warehouse was actually a compendium of multiple different databases, including the database from the National Institute for Discovery Science, which we had worked on for 8 years. But it also had multiple pilot databases, military pilots, civilian pilots. It had a really interesting database that was fundamentally focused on the entire Brazilian Colares incidents that were very pertinent from a UFO medical injury perspective. So a lot of cases and a lot of testimony went into that Colares databases. And then we also had multiple government, British government, French government, Brazilian government went through the whole release process. So I guess over many, many years, Jacques Vallée has been instrumental. So a lot of his thinking has permeated through both the National Institute for Discovery Science and OSAP. So we have been very, I think, careful in sort of negotiating our way through the process of interpreting all of this data. And I'm very loath to go down the road of what is actually happening here. Are we talking about extraterrestrials? Are we talking about interdimensional phenomena? Are we talking about ultra-terrestrials? Are we talking about sort of breakaway civilizations, the so-called crypto-terrestrials, or humans from the future? Ultimately, it's from a scientific perspective, it's incredibly difficult to distinguish between something like extraterrestrials from the very sparse data that we have versus interdimensionals, for example, or something even more exotic, as you're alluding to. I mean, fundamentally, from a scientific perspective, these kinds of distinguishing hallmarks are very, very few and far between.
Do you think we have hope? In other words, with an even bigger data set and continued exploration of the data set we have, can we find out more?
Absolutely. I would, yeah.
How do we do it?
Yeah. I think, not to sort of toot my own horn, but I think the Advanced Aerospace Weapons Systems Application Program, the way it turned out in terms of how efficient it became over a 27-month period in terms of data collection, and also reaching out and establishing contacts, was very, very efficient as a template for, I think, what a future UFO program could look like. Not only did the OSAP program get into collecting database, really getting multiple databases together, but we also had multiple boots on the ground, people who were willing to go out and investigate cases, sort of rapid reaction force. We teamed up with MUFON, an organization that has people in 50 separate states. And we were able to really sort of get into investigating multiple cases every month. And from establishing a template for a future UFO program, we think the OSAP program is probably a good candidate for doing that. We also had a lot of good people on board, physicists, biologists. We hired a bunch of database analysts. We had military intelligence people. We had counterintelligence people. We had retired police investigators. We even had a couple of MD PhDs on our staff that were specifically focused on these medical injury cases. And we investigated a few medical injury cases during the OSAP program, but This was only a very short 27-month program. It was terminated at the Defense Intelligence Agency because basically, I think, though not anticipate the level of the numbers of cases that would be investigated, but also the kinds of weird phenomena that were coming up as we followed the data. Because once you start looking at effects of UFOs on humans, you start opening up things like medical injury cases, physiological effects, pathological effects, psychological effects, and even paranormal effects. And we did follow the data, and we followed the data down some pretty bizarre rabbit holes. And so ultimately, the program ended after 27 months. But yeah, if that program had continued for maybe 5 to 10 years and expanded according to what the program plan looked like at the very beginning of this whole exercise, I think we would be a lot further along this sort of investigation.